Hi, this is Julie Lubinsky. I am the Associate Director of Digital for the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on road and rail trips for wheelchair users. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about our presenter. John Morris is one of the foremost experts in the field of accessible travel, drawing from his experience of nearly 1 million miles flown as a wheelchair user and triple amputee. And I invite you all to visit his website at wheelchairtravel.org after the webinar. Now I'd like to turn it over to John. Hi, John. Welcome back.
Hi, Julie. Thank you for having me. I am excited to talk about options for travel with a wheelchair that don't involve flying. I know that many people are very concerned about many of the aspects of traveling with a wheelchair and with limited mobility. And so I think that road and rail trips are a great topic to talk about, especially as we begin planning our trips for the new year. My name is John Morris, as Julie said. My website is wheelchairtravel.org. On that website, I provide information and tips about traveling to different destinations all around the world, and I also provide guidance on air travel, bus and rail travel as well. So there's a lot of information there that readers are able to access for free. If you came to this webinar because you saw one of the Facebook advertisements that we did to promote this, I'm sad to say that I'm not this really cool dude in the photograph, but I still have a lot to offer in terms of information about traveling on America's highways and railways. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where we're going to go on this journey today. I've broken this presentation up into 4 major categories: figuring out a destination and selecting a destination if you are going to travel in a vehicle or on the railway. Then I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into taking a road trip with a vehicle, things to consider, what some of the options are. I'll also talk about intercity bus services like Greyhound, and then move on to train travel with Amtrak. At the end, we will have time to answer all of your questions, so please, as we go through this presentation, if something comes up that you'd like some clarification on, or if you have a question that I haven't addressed, please just type it into the chat box. Julie will flag it for me, and I will be able to answer it at the end. I see we already have several questions on deck, and I will get to those at the end of the presentation. So the first stop on this journey is figuring out where we want to go. There are so many options, incredible destinations all around the country, and whether you want to visit national parks or major cities, monuments, there's so much to see and do in the USA, and I'm going to talk about some of the ways we can narrow down in selecting a destination appropriate for us. I first want to show a map here of the Amtrak network. This is where Amtrak's trains travel all across the country. So obviously there's many, many stops on the West Coast and in the Northeast, but I'm also a frequent rider of Amtrak in my home state of Florida. There are so many options for getting around on Amtrak, and this map of their network should provide some insight into where exactly the train can take you. This next photo here is of the Greyhound bus route network. Greyhound is a massive operation. They have almost 4,000 different stops across the country. They operate nearly 2,000 buses, and so that's certainly an option. Something also to consider is that the roadways, if you're going to travel in your own vehicle, the roadways stretch all across America. So there is nowhere that is off limits. If you have a vehicle and want to go on a road trip, you can discover whatever it is that you would like to see, take advantage of so many different opportunities for things to do. Some things to consider, though, in selecting a destination. Each of us have different concerns and challenges to deal with, and so figuring out exactly which place that we're going to go oftentimes comes down to answering the question of how am I going to get there? And so considering buses and trains, obviously they have a set route network. And while those maps that I showed you are very expansive, they don't travel to every town, city, and community in the country. Those services with their fixed routes don't go everywhere. If you are going to take a bus or a train, how are you going to get around the destination that you've selected? Obviously, we still have accessible ground transportation needs. Once we arrive, we have to get ourselves and our wheelchair from wherever we've been dropped off by the bus or the train to our hotel, to the different attractions, to the restaurants. So figuring out how you're going to get around the destination is very important. Are there taxis, public transportation options? Do you have a family member or a friend in the place that you're going who can transport you around in their own vehicle? That's certainly important to consider. Also, will you travel to a major city or somewhere off the beaten path? If you're going to go to a place that is not served by many of the different transportation networks or doesn't have accessible transportation in the location that you're visiting, then you may need to choose to take a vehicle of your own on the trip. And some modes of transit, of course, may be better suited for the itinerary that you want to build. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite itineraries. It's a road trip that I've taken many times, and it's really suitable for any of these options, whether it's a bus or a private vehicle. Train would be quite a bit more difficult, but still possible, and I'll talk about that in just a bit. First, I want to dig a little deeper into taking a road trip with a private or a rented vehicle. So let's get started with that. Obviously, we have to select the vehicle for our road trip. And the first question, obviously, is do you have an accessible vehicle of your own that will meet your needs, or will you need to rent one? And so I'll talk about some of those options, but that's obviously an easy question to answer. If you are going to rent a vehicle, what type of vehicle do you need to rent? Are you able to transfer in and out of a standard sedan, or do you need an adapted van with a ramp? That's very important. Are you going to drive the vehicle yourself, and will you need hand controls? That's important. How much storage space will you need for all of the equipment and luggage that you'll be taking on this trip? all very important things to consider in selecting the right vehicle. Does the destination that you're visiting or the time of year and the weather forecast in the place that you're going necessitate a certain type of vehicle? The sports car in that promotional photograph that we used might not be great in the wintertime if you're going up into the mountains where it's snowy. So it's important to consider all of these factors. And then also budget is very important to figure out. Setting a budget for your trip and being able to cover the cost of a vehicle rental, depending on the length or the type of vehicle that you're renting, that can be very costly. Alternatively, it could be quite affordable. And then also, if you're taking your own vehicle, will you be able to cover the costs of any unexpected repairs that might be necessary? If you blow a tire out on the roadway or something more serious occurs, will you be able to cover those costs? Next, I want to talk about some of the rented cars and adapted vans that are on the market and that are available for each of us to rent and take out on the road. Obviously, the least expensive, the most affordable route would be to rent a standard car from one of the major rental car companies like Alamo, Budget, Enterprise, or Hertz. Each of these companies do provide certain types of adaptive equipment for operating these vehicles, like hand controls and steering wheel spinner knobs. You can book these features via the different rental car companies' website. And then, of course, I also recommend that you call in once you've made a reservation to confirm that those features will be available and provided to you when you pick up the vehicle. It's important to notify the companies, the rental car companies, in advance, at least 24 hours, but I certainly recommend much more. And if you're planning your trip, if you're planning your road trip far enough in advance, you may be able to get an even better rental rate on the vehicle by booking all of this in advance. There is, of course, no cost to take advantage of the hand controls. These features are provided in accordance with requirements imposed on the rental car companies under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Adapted van rentals are much more accessible. I have an adapted van of my own. It allows me to take my power wheelchair into it because it has an electronic ramp that folds out into the driveway or out onto a sidewalk. It's very important for me because I use a power wheelchair. But there are also other features that can be provided by the companies that rent these types of vans, such as removing seats to allow you to sit in your wheelchair in the space that you prefer, or to accommodate a certain number of people in your traveling party. They can also provide hand controls and the steering wheel spinner knobs as well. And some companies are even able to provide further adaptations beyond that. So it's important to reach out if you have a specific need and you want to rent an adapted van, then to reach out to those companies and see if they will be able to provide the specific type of vehicle that will meet your needs. So where do you go to rent an adapted van? If that is what you need, if that's the route that you decide to take, there are really three major types of options. You can book direct with one of the manufacturers. So Braun Ability and AMS Vans or VMI Mobility are two manufacturing companies that actually build these adapted vans, and they also provide rental services in many locations around the country. So that's a great place to start. There are also other providers that are very well respected in the industry, like Mobility Works, Wheeler's Van Rentals, and Wheelchair Getaways. And thirdly, there are also smaller, very local providers. So the van in the photo on this slide is actually a VMI conversion van, but it was rented to me by Mobility Plus. They're a small company that only operates in the Florida Panhandle. So if you want to go on a beach vacation, I rented this van to take it to a wedding and spend some time in the Panhandle and Pensacola and Fort Walton Beach and all of that. It's very lovely, but you can also look in the location. I recommend just searching on Google. Say you want to rent a van in outside of Chicago. You just type in wheelchair van rentals in Chicago, and Google will deliver many of the results and connecting you with some of those companies that might offer van rental services. Of course, I said earlier that the most affordable option for renting a vehicle is a standard vehicle that's not won't come equipped with a ramp or features such as that, but you can still you'll get the best deal through one of the major rental car companies. The cost of renting an adapted wheelchair van is much higher because the cost of these vans is much more than a Ford Focus or something like that. The base rental rate is typically $125 a day if you're renting by the day, about $100 a day if you're renting for a week, so say $700 for a week, $80 a day for a monthly rental. So obviously these costs are quite high. You'll get a better deal on a daily average rate for the longer that you book the vehicle. So that's a good way to get a better deal on the daily average. Rates do vary based on the season and demand, and I will strongly recommend that if you have a trip in mind and you're going to need one of these vans, to book it as far in advance as possible. I was in Nashville earlier this year, and a friend of mine and I decided that we wanted to take a trip outside of the city, and we needed a van. And so I called at the start of our trip. We were there for 4 or 5 days, and there was no availability from any of the companies in Nashville that rented vans for that week. So if I had made the reservation before the trip, I would have been able to venture outside of the city. So it's very important to get your reservation in as soon as you're ready to move forward with planning the rest of the trip. Something that is very important to note, however, is that van rentals, typically, these accessible van rentals, include only 100 miles of driving each day. So if you book a van for a week, you'll have 700 miles to use across that week. Most companies charge an average of about 30 cents per mile that you go over the included allotment. So it can become very costly if your trip will require more driving than is included in your rental contract. Delivery can also be made to an airport, a hotel, or elsewhere by these accessible van companies. Typically, the cost starts at about $75, and it will just depend on how far they are having to take the vehicle to you. And then also, another requirement in renting one of these vehicles is that you have full accident and collision coverage, car insurance that can be applied to the rental vehicle. Obviously, these vehicles are very expensive when the companies buy them, and they want to make sure that if you do get into an accident, that the vehicle will be fully insured. Some tools for building the perfect road trip itinerary. I've taken quite a few road trips myself, and these 4 different tools are ones that I use on each road trip. The first is roadtrippers.com. It's a website, a blog. It has travel guides, sample itineraries. Obviously, these are not written with accessibility in mind, but you're able to do the additional research that will be required about the accessibility of the hotels and attractions and things that are recommended. I just think that roadtrippers.com provides an excellent starting point for figuring out what some of the possibilities with a road trip are. What are other people doing when they're deciding and planning a road trip of their own? Google Maps is a tool that's excellent for figuring out directions. Once you're in the location, it can help you with public transportation options. It can tell you what is near to you in the area of where you're staying and visiting. And then also Google has a mobile app called Google Trips that can be used to keep track of all of your different bookings. So hotel reservations, event tickets. It will collect all of these things from your email inbox and present it to you in a lovely display so that you can keep track of all of your different plans as you do embark on the road trip. Many people, when they take a road trip, they plan out everything in advance, so they have a totally set itinerary. And that's certainly a great option and will probably yield the best results in terms of the accessible experience, because you'll have done all of the planning and you'll be more certain of what you're going to face while out on the road. But I have more of a style of being spontaneous, or as spontaneous as I can possibly be. And so when I've been out on road trips, I have had a general idea of what my itinerary was going to be. But maybe I go to a place and I'm like, we really enjoyed it here, and I'd like to spend an extra night. Or I just heard about from another traveler out here on the road that there's a really cool site to see that's a couple hours out of the way, but I would still like to do that. It's not something I'd planned on doing, but I added in the last minute. And so in that case, I will turn to a website like Trivago to readjust my accommodation, to figure out where I'm going to stay in the new destination that's been added, or where I can get the best deal on a hotel at the last minute. And so I highly recommend Trivago, not necessarily for booking your hotel, but for giving you great insight onto what the best prices are and where you can get the best deal. It's excellent. Then the fourth tool is a mobile app. It's called the iExit Interstate Exit Guide. So, if you're rolling along on the freeway and you want to figure out where is the best place to stop or which exit will have the things you need, whether it's a Walmart or a restaurant or a gas station, this mobile app has all of the information about the different businesses and services that are available at exits that are going to be coming up on your journey. So that's a fantastic tool to utilize. Back to road trippers for a second. I said that I would talk about one of my favorite road trip itineraries, and this particular itinerary is one of my favorites because it's relatively short. The drives are very interesting. They're not so boring. The stops between the different destinations on this itinerary, or the distances between the different destinations, are very manageable. And so I've done this road trip many times. It includes stops in Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Nashville, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri, and then finally the destination is Chicago. And essentially what this screenshot shows is how you're able to build an itinerary on road trippers, and then in the midst of each of these, you can highlight certain attractions or restaurants that you want to try, and you can carry this entire itinerary in your pocket on your mobile phone, your iPhone or your Android. You can download this application and build out the perfect itinerary. One question that I get asked a lot from my readers who are planning to take a road trip is what parking looks like and how to deal with parking when you're traveling out of state. Many people are concerned that their parking placard, for instance, I have a Florida parking placard, will that hang tag be accepted if I go to Georgia or California or wherever I might be traveling? Is that a legitimate, or will I get a ticket for using it in a accessible parking space? Fortunately, the federal government came through with a regulation that states that each state has to honor parking decals for accessible parking spots that are issued by other states. So there is reciprocity. You don't have to worry about anything. Just make sure that your hang tag is displayed at all times when you are parked, so that you won't face any issues with that. Now, I want to move on to bus services. When I first started traveling with my wheelchair, I had no idea that buses could be accessible. I would see the Greyhound buses driving by on the interstate, and I just had no idea that these buses are accessible. But it turns out that they are. And I am a very, very frequent Greyhound rider. At least 2 or 3 times a month I'm riding on the Greyhound in states all across the country. So there are some fantastic options for using the bus to get around. There are national and regional providers of bus services. So Greyhound is the largest. It's the one that everyone knows. They have 3,800 stops across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and they operate in every state except Alaska and Hawaii. So Greyhound can really take you places. It operates just about everywhere, and there are nearly 2,000 buses in their fleet to take you around. Megabus is another service that I use on occasion, and they operate in this list of states here: California, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, so on. There are so many states that Megabus covers, and I'll talk more about the features on these buses in just a minute. Peter Pan is one of the regional providers in the Northeast, and there are many other regional and local bus services throughout the country that are wheelchair accessible. Greyhound accessibility, just some quick facts about the features that are available on Greyhound's buses. First of all, every single bus in the Greyhound fleet is wheelchair accessible. Each bus has 2 wheelchair spaces on board. These spaces are created by pushing forward and condensing the standard seats to reveal clear floor space to secure the wheelchair. There is a hydraulic lift that's used for helping the wheelchair and its user board the bus, and each wheelchair space has a 4-point tie-down system. They're using on Greyhound the Q-straint straps to secure wheelchairs to the floor of the bus. And you can book trips and the wheelchair space on the bus using the website and the mobile app. So it's very stress-free. I just pull up my phone, click on the Greyhound app, and then within about a minute I've reserved the trip that I want, along with the space to accommodate my wheelchair. Here is a picture of one of the hydraulic lifts on the bus that's used to lift the wheelchair and its user onto the bus. So that's me in the photo being lifted up onto the Greyhound bus with the hydraulic lift. Pretty easy process. Next is a photo of me in my wheelchair on a Greyhound bus. You can see there's space to accommodate the wheelchair. My wheelchair is secured. There's a strap that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. So the wheelchair is secured to the floor. I'm able to tilt and recline and sit comfortably in my own wheelchair for the duration of the bus journey. The seats behind the wheelchair are blocked off, so no one will be sitting directly behind you and kicking your wheelchair. So it's a great bit of accessibility that was brought to Greyhound to make riding in a wheelchair possible. Megabus, since I feel like they are one of the second most common bus services used by wheelchairs, I want to talk about their accessibility as well. They do have an accessible fleet. Each bus has 1 wheelchair space. These are double-decker buses, so only the lower deck is accessible. There's a space to stow a wheelchair on board. In this case, since it's a double-decker bus and it has a low floor, you're able to board the bus using a ramp. The wheelchair space does have a 4-point tie-down system for securing wheelchairs, but I must stress that power wheelchairs are not tied down securely. The space that they have allotted and where they have placed the strap tie-down positions doesn't allow for the chair to be fully secure. Now, if you're a manual wheelchair user, you won't have that issue. It's much easier to truly secure a manual wheelchair on the Megabus. And you can also use the website and the mobile app for booking accessible trips on Megabus. Here is a photo of the ramp that is used for boarding the Megabus. If you lay it out onto the curb, it is basically level entry, but if the stop does not have a curb, the ramp can be quite a bit steeper, but I've never really had any difficulty in getting on board the bus. Here is a photo of me in my wheelchair on the bus. So like a Greyhound, they push some seats forward, condense a few rows of standard seating to make room for the wheelchair. The space is towards the back of the bus and the rear door, so you go up the ramp and turn right, and then that's where you sit. I get asked a lot about how long of a trip is possible on a Greyhound or a Megabus. These services operate in many different destinations, and you could ride the Greyhound from California to New York if you want. But there are some things that I want you to consider when you're deciding what is the longest trip that you could endure on a bus. First thing I want to say is that the total trip length that is advertised, what is scheduled, should be considered a best case scenario. If you're making bus connections, while I haven't been terribly inconvenienced by delayed buses, this does happen. And so when you're trying to plan out a trip, it's important to understand that the schedule you book may not actually be what is delivered. If you have a 1-hour connection in a city from one bus route to another, and your inbound is late, then you could be waiting for hours for the next bus to take you to your destination. So use the schedules that are posted as a guide, but not as a guarantee. Also, considering how frequently you'll need to use the bathroom. These buses do not have accessible toilets, and so you're going to have to plan to use the bathroom on the scheduled stops and breaks. These are all clearly described on the itinerary, so that's something to use also as a guide. How many connections will be necessary for your itinerary? Obviously, the longer distance you travel, the more likely you'll be to have connections. And even if your itinerary doesn't list a connection, buses have to be fueled, and so typically the longest a bus will be operating is somewhere between 5 and 8 hours before it has to stop to be refueled and cleaned, and at that time everyone gets off the bus and they have time in the Greyhound station to go to the bathroom, get something to eat, and whatnot. And then also it's important to carry on any supplies that will be necessary because you're not going to, if you store a checked bag in the cargo compartment, you're not going to just be able to say, hey, let's stop so I can get something out of my bag. So carry on anything that's necessary, and that's now, using the bathroom, I talked about this very briefly a second ago, but just to reiterate, the bus's onboard toilet is not wheelchair accessible. It's at the back of the bus. There's no wheelchair access, so you're not going to be able to use the toilet that's installed on the bus. The bus will not make a special pit stop if you have to go to the bathroom. So it's important to time your use of the bathroom to the different stops that are made on the itinerary. The scheduled stops and layovers are noted, but will they be long enough? Typically, they'll stop at a pit stop, a bathroom break, a place to get something to eat along the route. That stop usually lasts for about 30 minutes, and then there are longer stops on connections or when the bus needs to refuel. Those can last anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. If you're taking a connection, sometimes the stop can be quite a bit longer, just depending on the schedule. And if you do have, if you catheterize or have a leg bag, those are especially useful on trips lasting more than a few hours. It's just super convenient to use those tools so that you're not constantly worried about when the next bathroom stop will be. Now, moving on to trains. I love trains. They are an amazingly accessible way to travel. They also provide stunning views of America, as you can see in this photo, which is shared by Amtrak. The fall leaves and colors are just stunning, and there's so much that you can see in so many places that you can go on Amtrak. But what I want to talk to you about are the different accessibility features of the Amtrak trains and deciding which might be best for you. There are two different train services really in operation right now. One is the standard train, and the other is the Acela. So I'll be showing photos from those different types of trains as we go through this. But the first question that I always get is, how do I get onto the train? Can I take my wheelchair onto the train? How do I board the rail car? And so there are two different ways that boarding is done. First is if the station has a high platform, meaning the platform itself is not level with the ground, it's higher. In these cases, Amtrak uses what is called a bridge plate to bridge the gap between the train and the platform, and so you essentially get a level entry. You roll right onto the train over this bridge plate, which is a ramp to bridge that gap, and you can roll right onto the train. In stations with a low platform, meaning the platform itself is relatively level with the ground, the train will sit quite a bit higher, and you'll need to be lifted onto the train using a wheelchair lift. So in this photo on the right, for a low platform, this wheelchair lift is used to crank the wheelchair user up to the entryway of the train. Accessible bathrooms on the trains. The Acela high-speed train, which runs from Washington, D.C. up to Boston, is the most accessible train right now on longer distance service in the United States. You can see in the photo on the left that the bathroom is very spacious. You can turn a wheelchair around in there. There are grab bars. space to park a wheelchair alongside the toilet. It is, by all accounts, for a train, a very accessible bathroom. On the right side, though, is a photo of one of the bathrooms on the standard trains. For instance, one that is used in the Northeast Regional Corridor, so it's a slower train, more affordable. The tickets are cheaper than if you were to book a Acela, but the bathroom is not as accessible. The quarters are very tight. You can't really turn a wheelchair around in place in these bathrooms, and so the transfers onto the toilet will be a little more difficult. The great value, though, in these is that if you do catheterize, that you will have a place to do this in privacy. You can roll your wheelchair in, close the door. If you need some help in there, there's generally room to accommodate another person, but as I said, the space is very tight, and so the transfers will be difficult. Just something to keep in mind. Accessible seating areas. On the left is the Acela train. Acela sells tickets in business and first class. It doesn't have a standard coach service because Acela was designed to appeal to business travelers traveling from the Mid-Atlantic to the Northeast. So from Boston to New York or New York to Washington, D.C. So Acela only has a business and first class. This picture here is of the business class. The wheelchair space has a table. There's also a seat that you can transfer into and then park your wheelchair in the wheelchair space. The crew on board the train should be able to help you with these things. And then on the right is the standard train. It's very spacious. There's a space to park your wheelchair. There's no securement, but on rail generally that's not something that you'll need. And then also a couple of seats that you can transfer into as well. So these are the different looks of the accessible seating areas on board Amtrak's different styles of train. Benefits of taking the train over the bus. Number one for me, and the reason that I love traveling by rail so much, is that Amtrak generally runs from one city center to another city center. So if you're going from Boston to New York, you leave from Penn Station in New York, which is not too far away from Times Square, maybe 10 blocks or so, and then you can go to Boston and be dropped off right at South Station in the center of the city. And so this is a great advantage to Amtrak because they are operating from one city to another, and they're dropping you off right in the middle where you'll have access to public transportation, the metro, the subway, the city bus, whatever the city that you're visiting offers. You'll be right in the center of the city to take advantage of that. Or just, you can be within walking distance of your hotel. These are all things that you can keep in mind when you're planning your specific trip, where you'll stay, where you'll go, etc. Trains provide some space to operate the wheelchair on board, and then also transferring between the wheelchair and a standard seat is possible. And during the journey, you can get in and out whenever you like, whereas on a bus, if you were to transfer into a standard seat, you can do that when you board, but then they will need to secure your wheelchair for the journey, and you won't have access to it again until the next stop. Trains have a partially accessible toilet. I've shown photographs of what those toilets look like and described some of the features. You'll have to decide whether or not that those will work for you and if they are appealing. But I think it's certainly better to have access to a toilet that's partially accessible than to not have access to a toilet at all. And then also food and beverage services are provided on board the train. Amtrak has a menu that you can order from. The conductor will go fetch whatever you'd like from the cafe car on board. So you'll be able to take advantage of the meal services without ever having to leave the train. And so at this point, I am excited to take any questions. I'm going to dive deeper into some of these topics, I suspect, with your questions. But since we only had an hour, that's a quick overview of planning a road or a rail trip. So I'm going to take a look. We have 11 questions in the queue right now, and I'd love for more to be added. So just type down into the Q&A box, and I will get on with it. First question I saw was not really related to this, but does one being a wheelchair user make it impossible to fly on an airplane? And so that answer is no. I actually did a webinar some months ago on that topic of flying with a wheelchair, and so yes, you can do that. And something that I didn't say earlier is you can, if you mix flying and taking a road trip, you can create some really incredible experiences. Maybe you want to fly up to Alaska and then rent a van, an accessible van, to take on a road trip in Alaska. That is certainly a possibility. So it doesn't always have to be an either-or situation. You can take advantage of flying and buses and trains and a private vehicle. You can mix all four together to create whatever type of trip that you would like. Question here about whether mobility scooters can be used on board trains and buses and taking a road trip with a mobility scooter. The answer is yes, of course. Depending on the length of the mobility scooter, it could be more difficult to navigate some of the tight spaces on the train, for instance. But it's certainly possible to utilize these. I would just recommend that you study the dimensions to figure out if there will be any problems, and also in selecting the appropriate mobility scooter for the trip that you want to take. Is the observation car still inaccessible on Amtrak? Yes. Unfortunately, Amtrak on the upper deck has, in some of the trains operating in the Northwest, and they have an observation car where you can take in panoramic views of the surrounding area. These cars are not accessible. Very, very disappointing, I know. Yes, so another question about the observation cars and the upper levels of Amtrak. I know that Amtrak is working on trains of the future. There's a lot of investment that's going on right now into rehabbing existing trains, and then they're also planning for new trains to come into the standard service and then also into the Acela high-speed service. And so hopefully we'll learn more about the accessibility of those future trains in the future. But I do know one positive is that the standard trains, as they are replaced with new rolling stock, with new train cars, they will have much more accessible bathrooms like Acela does now. The older trains have been grandfathered in to the accessibility regulations, and so that's why the standard trains have toilets that are less accessible than the brand new Acela trains. Do you still need to reserve a space on Greyhound with 2 days advance notice? No. I have booked Greyhound tickets about an hour before departure. That is possible. The only problem is that in order to accommodate a wheelchair, Greyhound has to take either 4 or 6 standard seats out of service. And so if, for instance, the bus only has 2 seats available, that's not enough to accommodate a wheelchair, and so that bus would not be bookable for a wheelchair user. So it's very important to book in advance, but in a lot of cases, if demand on a particular route or schedule is not so high, you can theoretically book up until the last minute. Okay, so could I talk more about the requirements on bus trips of a certain length to stop to allow wheelchair users to use the bathroom? These stops are scheduled, and so you just need to look at the particular itinerary that you're booking. I think generally the stops last about 30 minutes. There are shorter stops sometimes built in. They'll, I hear this all the time. If you're stopping in a small little town to pick up passengers, it might be scheduled for 10 minutes. And they'll let people off to use the bathroom there. But if you are obviously a wheelchair user, you're going to probably need more than 10 minutes. There's time involved with getting off the bus, being unstrapped, unsecured, going down the hydraulic lift, and then actually using the facilities. So I recommend in those cases to have a conversation with the bus driver. If they're allowing other people to get off the bus and use the restroom, they should provide that same opportunity to you. But I think that it's also important to understand that they're not going to turn a 10-minute stop into a 45-minute stop. And so if you need 30 or 45 minutes to use the bathroom, then it's very important to plan to use it when a longer stop is scheduled. Yeah, so this is interesting. Karen comes with a question here about a trip that she took on Megabus from Austin to San Antonio. And she said that, her getting on board in her wheelchair displaced 6 people from their seats. And this is true on both Megabus and Greyhound. There is a certain section where a wheelchair space can be made, and so the seats are on a track. They push forward and out of the way to reveal that space. And if you're not getting on the bus at the start of its journey, so for instance, Greyhound has a main station in Atlanta and another main station in Houston, Texas, and others across the country. But the trip itinerary on that particular bus begins at one of those main stations. But say you're riding from you're on the Atlanta to Houston schedule, but you are not getting on the bus until New Orleans. Well, when you're in New Orleans, there could when the bus stops to pick you up in New Orleans, there could already be people in the seats, sitting in the seats where the wheelchair user would need to go. And so they'll be asked to get up, and the people could be frustrated. It's definitely an awkward situation, and you might feel awkward about it, but the reality is that's the only place that you can sit, and my opinion is that other passengers just need to get over that. Are there any Amtrak first class rooms that are wheelchair accessible? Yes. I didn't go into that here in this webinar, but there are roomettes, accommodations with seats that turn into a bed on the bus, on the trains. Not every train has these. For instance, if you're traveling from Washington, D.C. to New York, that's just essentially a commuter service. But on longer distance trains, say you're traveling from Chicago to California, there will be these accessible spaces, accessible rooms available for booking. The cost is quite high, but you can book those roomettes, as they call them, on the Amtrak website. Are there tie-downs available on trains? The answer is no. It's not a required accessibility feature. Generally, since the train operates on a set track, there won't be any sudden or unexpected movements, and rail crashes are still rare, so safer to ride on a train than in a motor vehicle. How do we arrange for accessibility seating on Amtrak? You can do this on the web. You can also call to make a booking. And so there's a feature on the Amtrak website when it will list the type of passenger. So say one passenger, adult. You click the drop-down button on adult and select passenger with disability. That also entitles you to a 15% discount on the Amtrak fare. So that's great as well. Since dining cars are not accessible, and they are not, do you suggest bringing your own food? You can bring your own food, but you can also have the conductor go collect food for you from the dining or cafe car. Do I have a list of actual hotels that I've used? I review a lot of hotels on my website, and in my destination guides, I list different accessible hotels. And I also list the hotels that I have stayed in on a per-city basis. What are my thoughts on bi-level train equipment? Such as Amtrak Superliner cars, or, for instance, commuter rail services like those in California or New Jersey or New York. I will say the bi-level trains on Amtrak are a little less accessible. The bathroom is a, it's a bit smaller than the standard photo that I used, and I'll go back to that. It's just a bit smaller, but they are easier to board a bi-level train car because it's a lower platform, or it's a lower train car, lower to the ground, and so in stations that do use these bi-level trains, you are able to essentially roll right on board with a bridge plate. And do the buses provide seat belts as well as 4-point tie-downs? Yes, they provide both of those. Is there an extra charge for extra baggage? So you are able to check bags on both Greyhound and Amtrak and Megabus as well. They only allow one bag on buses for free, but if you're traveling with mobility equipment, that can also be taken for free. Yes, in looking at Amtrak, it seems if you are going cross-country, such as Florida to Chicago, there are very long layovers in the station, 9 hours or more. How have you handled that? Depending on the time of the layover, if it's a daytime layover, I would love to go out and explore the city. If it is late in the evening or at night, then I get a hotel. I think that's the best thing to do. That, of course, increases some of the investment that you're making into the trip. But I think number one overall should be comfort and ensuring that you have the time to take any pressure relief that you need. And for me, that's very important. So I don't want to sit in my wheelchair for 2 days straight on a long journey. I'd like to take those times to lay down whenever possible. Are the bridge plates and ramps or lifts stored on the train or at the station? They are stored at the station for Amtrak trains. So if you need a bridge plate or a wheelchair lift to access the train car, just speak with someone at the station, and they will be able to accommodate you. People in wheelchairs should be able to use the observation deck. I agree wholeheartedly. Hopefully, in the future, as new trains are designed and developed, that will be the case. First class rooms, are they wheelchair accessible? Sleeping accommodations? Yes, they are. You will be restricted to that train car, but in the accessible rooms, there's a bathroom as well as a bed to lay down in. So that's fantastic. Cruise lines, not necessarily the question for this webinar, but I can say that we will be doing a webinar on accessible cruising, I believe next year. How do you feel about the new single-level cars like those being used on Florida's Brightline? I think that Brightline is a new train service. It's a semi-high-speed train service in Florida. It's eventually going to connect South Florida, so Miami, with Orlando. That's a flight that takes about an hour, but the train journey will take a bit longer, but it will also prevent you from having to go to the airport and go through security and actually fly on an airplane. So I love Brightline. I have said that as of right now, I think it's the most accessible train in America, but it doesn't go a very long distance. There are other services. Brightline is also planning to launch a service between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. So that will create a new opportunity. And there's also a new high-speed train coming to Texas that is going to go between Dallas and Houston. So these are all very exciting developments. And since these new projects are new, like Acela for Amtrak, they are much more accessible than the standard train cars that we are seeing. And so I think that really answers the questions that we have here. Yeah, Julie, I think that we have tackled them all.
Great, thank you. So we'll end today's webinar and keep an eye out for your link. This is being archived on our YouTube channel, and I'll send a link to all registrants. And I'd like to thank John for joining us again for our Road and Rails, and looking forward to having you again about more accessible travel. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Have a good day.